Okay, we're now live. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining. We hope you all enjoyed the film as much as we did. My name is Deirdre Fitzgerald, and I am the board chair for the Monadnock International Film Festival. We hope you've come away with some wonderful questions to ask both our moderator and our panelists. And you can feel free to add your questions to the chat, which is in the little bar at the bottom of your screen, or into the Q&A, which is also at the bottom of the bar, in the bottom bar of your screen. And we will incorporate those in as we go through this discussion. Before I introduce MaryAnne Howland, your moderator, I just wanted to say a few quick thank yous to our partners, the Monadnock Food Co-op, Monadnock Farm and Community Coalition, First Nations Institute, and of course, gather.film. Now I'd like to introduce you to MaryAnne. MaryAnne Howland is chair of the American Sustainable Business Council Race and Equity Working Group. She's also an author, and you can see a picture of the book behind her there, Warrior Rising, and the founder and CEO of EBIS Communications and Global Diversity Leadership Exchange. She's also the co-founder of Jedi Collaborative. And welcome, and thank you, MaryAnne, and I'll let you take it away.
Well, thank you so much, and good evening, everyone. And so first, I just have to ask, so what did you think? It's phenomenal, right? How about another round of applause for this incredible film? So Gather, a New York Times critic's pick, as you all may now know, is igniting critical discussions around land rights and the original theft of land, which enabled the American farming economy to develop and expand. Indigenous people are the original developers of regenerative practices, and it's time to correct history and to educate people on what drove the destruction of the environment, extractive colonial capitalism. From the displacement of Native peoples and the mass slaughter of buffalo, and now to monocropping and large-scale livestock farming, nothing has been a bigger driver of wholesale devastation than agribusiness. So here with us live after the film to bring you inside the story about the destruction of Native American foodways and how the White Mountain Apache Nation, working with environmental activists, is reclaiming their cultural identity, are three of the people responsible for the film we just all experienced. We've got Sanjay Rawal, an award-winning filmmaker and director. He's an advocate for equality and has spent 15 years working on human rights campaigns globally. His first feature film, which a lot of you may have seen, called Food Chains with Yvonne Lagoria and Eric Schlosser, was narrated by Forrest Whitaker. It's a fantastic film, and if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend that too. Sanjay has won a James Beard Foundation Award in 2015 for the documentary. And his second effort took a sharp turn into non-traditional filmmaking, applying narrative cinematic technique. Sanjay directed the sweeping expedition 3100, Run and Become, released theatrically in the US in 2018. Also with us is Adae Romero-Briones, who became Director of Programs for Native Agriculture and Food Systems in 2017. And after first joining First Nations as Associate Director of Research and Policy for Native Agriculture. She formerly was the Director of Community Development for Pulama Lanai in Hawaii, and is also the co-founder and former Executive Director of a nonprofit organization in Cochito Pueblo, New Mexico. And Liz Charlebois is an Abenaki educator, nurse, artist, and leader. She was chair of the New Hampshire Commission on Native American Affairs from 2013 to 2016, on which she served from 2010 to 2016. Liz is a founding member of I-Collective. She is an accomplished I-Collective, indigenous, inspired, innovative, and independent. And I'm sure we'll hear more about that later. She is an accomplished basket maker, bead worker, dancer, and farmer. And Liz's focus is growing and preserving Northeastern indigenous crops. She has established a seed library dedicated to those seeds. And Liz uses the food she grows in many indigenous dishes, both traditional and contemporary. I bet it's delicious. She's a member of the younger generation of Abenaki people who are working to preserve and revitalize the culture, history, and identity of our original inhabitants. So let's have a round of applause for our 3 guest speakers who are responsible for this incredible film. Thank you for this tremendous work that you guys put together. This film about food sovereignty took me into a space of urgency, but without the anxiety. Instead, I was filled with a vision that is possible. And I wanted to thank you for that. The words that came up for me personally were recovery, transformation, survival, nurturing, multi-generational wisdom. Phrases that came up for me were, that I heard throughout the talk, were apprenticeship to truth, holistic journey from colonialism to freedom, harvesting is healing. The images that came in my head while I was listening and watching the film were sunrise dances, rivers teeming with salmon, the sound of 1,000,000 buffalo. And then we heard Rawley's mom when she talks about her and Nephi's 2 new babies coming at nearly the same time, Café Gozo and Rowley, that she said it takes time for really beautiful things to be made. And I thought this was fitting for the film, Sanjay. It's so artfully done. There were points when it made me say out loud angrily, "Damn, white people." And then the cruel injustice also made me cry several times. Then Nephi and Café Gozo and Elsie's passion and the Ancestral Guard, the young men becoming warriors, made me hopeful for the future. It was a story of hope for all of us. When Nephi said to the young men in training, when you don't know where to start, you have to do something. Just start singing. It made me think of the great Professor Cornel West's theory about music as a part of the movement, about Aretha Franklin singing R-E-S-P-E-C-T, and Marvin Gaye's What's Going On. We know all the words because they come from the soul. So as Marvin says, what's going on, Sanjay? Where's the soul of this work today?
Thank you very much for having me. I would actually love to have, love to have Liz start. You know, in this age of COVID, we're all virtual, but no doubt if things were more normal, we would be on her land. And I'd love for her to introduce us to where we should be right now.
Oh, thanks. Well, I appreciate that acknowledgement. And yeah, definitely the Northeast is Abenaki territory. I've recently moved from New Hampshire to Vermont. So one of the great things about Abenaki land is that it covers a huge part of northern New England, New Hampshire, Vermont, parts of Maine, parts of New York, parts of Massachusetts, and a good part of Quebec. So some things that we are doing here in terms of food security, which is definitely super important, is we're seeing this great resurgence and revitalization in native foodways. And that is happening across the nation. What's different here is that we've had 500 years of contact versus 200 years in other communities. Now, so what that means is 300 more years of colonialization, of colonialism, of cultural genocide. You know, there's a theme in the movie that I noticed about, you know, the heaviness that comes along and the trauma that comes along with being in a colonized community. And we see a lot of that in New England. For years and years and years, you know, it wasn't even, it's not safe to be Native here due to, you know, eugenics programs and forced sterilizations. And, you know, many families, if they could pass as French, would move out of the area to become French because it was safer that way. So obviously, traditional phase took a hit. So what we're seeing now is, you know, really getting back in touch with the traditional food and using those as a way to not only heal health disparities, but also cultural disparities. So things that I'm doing personally is, as MaryAnne mentioned in my bio, I grow Northeast indigenous food varieties. You know, the corn, beans, squash, and sunflowers. So, and what I do with those seeds is I have started a seed library, and I give them to indigenous people in the area. With the intent that, you know, these seeds will feed families. You know, those of us who have, who work in the food sovereignty movement have know that, you know, around the 1900s, there was really a push with seed companies to sort of garner the market on certain seed varieties. And what that happened is it caused mass extinction with a lot of varieties. We see a tiny portion of varieties from compared to 100 years ago. So part of what I do is I save those seeds in order to continue them for my 7 generations past me. We think of things in terms of 7 generations. So what we're seeing manifest today is a result of 7 generations ago. And it's our jobs to preserve the things for our descendants 7 generations from now. So the way I carry myself, the work that I'm doing now is going to benefit my children, my grandchildren, et cetera, et cetera. So I try to frame my work in that context. It's not about how it benefits me. It's how it benefits those who come after me. And I think that you'll see that a lot in Native communities. It's not, we're healing ourselves, we're healing our communities for those who come later. Other things that we're doing are, and it was mentioned at the end of the film when you guys spoke with Danielle Hill of the Mashpee Wampanoag about changing the narrative of New England Native folks. And in the film, it was in context to Thanksgiving. And that is a huge thing. You know, Native folks have been historically written out of history intentionally, especially in New England. We hear a lot of, there aren't any Indians in New England anymore. There are no Indians in New Hampshire. This comes from, you know, a governmental level. You know, and it's like, you don't have to provide services or give acknowledgement to people that you've consciously written out of history. If they're not there, you don't have to do anything for them. That doesn't mean that they really are gone, but from the public eye, a lot of Native folks are not visible in this area. So, you know, it's really important to change that narrative and to you know, be visible. And, you know, and talking about these seeds and these plants, and just you know, just being present is super important. You know, some other things that are happening in the Northeast are Vermont especially is working towards restoring hunting and gathering and fishing rights for Native folks. I know that one of the tribes in Vermont has worked very closely with the Vermont state government to get these rights back for indigenous folks. And that's super important and definitely a step in the right direction. Some of these other communities represented in the film have also gone through these battles. It really struck a chord with me when we were talking about the California Pacific Coast and the fish-ins. And in Vermont in the 70s, we were also having fish-ins in Abenaki territory. So you know, it's heartening to see that we're all in this together, you know, regardless of where we're from geographically.
Mm-hmm.
So
that's a lot of points that you hit on in your answer, Liz, that really appreciate. But one of them is the discussion about regenerative agriculture. Mm-hmm. And this question, well, first let me just say, in this film, you talk about a restorative revolution. And what struck me about the topic is that my pushback is that we need reparation and restoration before we get to regenerative. But so my question might be for Adae. I know that you kind of push back on that as well, but can you talk about why you push it back against the model of regenerative agriculture? What does that mean for you?
Absolutely, and thank you for the question. I think that's a term we hear often right now in a lot of food circles, is we have to be regenerative, we have to be looking at regenerative models. And really, I think you're right? There's, in the field of agriculture, we're, you know, in modern history, we're considered to be part of the fourth revolution in agriculture, the first being like from hunter-gatherers, the second being the industrial agriculture, the third being like the GE movement. And so when we think about those things, those different stages of revolution, indigenous people and people of color have been excluded from the very beginning. Like the line between who was civilized and who was not was agriculture in general. And so all the brown people were on one side and all the white people are on one side. And really it's the civilized people, according to this narrative, that are privy to the land and privy to the seeds and privy to property ownership. And so until we really review and like rectify what we mean by the very basic term agriculture, any consequential revolution in agriculture is based on a falsity. Like we really have to come to terms with what we mean by agriculture and that history that affects all of us, not just white people, not just brown people. It's a collective history that we really have to come to terms with. And I think now is the perfect time to actually come to terms with those historical narratives that exclude indigenous people, that exclude Black people, that exclude people of color. And that's where we should really start the conversation. As much as I like the term regenerative and looking at how to rebirth like systems and make them function properly, we need to make sure those systems function properly with everyone included in the system, which includes indigenous and Black people.
So there's so much truth in all of that. Oh, I love it. And so what comes to mind is what I think you refer to as kin-centric land stewardship and ecology. Correct? That seems like that's such an important concept in order to get back to what is the core of what will become regenerative, right?
Absolutely. Like concentric ecology, it's the idea that, you know, there's all these terms to describe how humans interact with the lands that we are on or that we currently produce food on. But in indigenous communities, as Liz so eloquently pointed out, we're related to the land. We are from these lands. These lands are very much a part of us as we're a part of them, regardless of what legal ownership title may be on some of these landscapes. We are part of these lands, and being part of those lands means we have relationships with those lands. And really that's what concentric ecology means, is that we're related to the land, we're related to our food, and that's where we get our behaviors and our cultural framework to interact with one another, is these lands and these relationships that we have to the food. And it's really embodied in the food. And so like we learn from that, and that's really what concentric ecology is. And again, that's not a term used by a lot of folks in regenerative agriculture or sustainable agriculture or organic agriculture. There's so many terms out there, but I think concentric ecology, which is coined by Enrique Salomon, who's Tarahumara from Mexico, explains, I think, the indigenous concept of relationship and spirituality and, I guess, teachings and learnings that we receive from our food and our land. And that, thank you.
And the film conveyed that so well. I mean, you know, when, you know, the rushing waters and the, you know, and you know, the whole idea of protecting the salmon, and, you know, how important it is to not only the economy, but the nutrition and the, you know, and then the buffalo, it was so beautifully done. And the storytelling was so rich, but I have to ask, and this is a question for you, Sanjay. Are there stories that you discovered along the way that didn't make the film that you wished had? And if so, you know, can you share with us any that will be maybe in the next film?
Well, that's a great question. Yes, most films, when we make them, we accumulate an abundance of stories, and there's a lot of films that have hundreds of hours of great content that will never see the light of day. When it came to the concept of making a film about Native American food sovereignty, when Native American in its own definition is a misnomer, hundreds of tribes, thousands of traditions, some still existing in federally recognized realms, some still existing in much smaller bands, we realized that we had to do a lot of research and really hone the ideas down so that we didn't bother people for 10 years. And so the original concept of the film was looking at areas of the continental United States that resisted the US military capitalist colonization. You know, of course, the first people that really, quote, pioneered were business people. The military, they came from England, with the exception of the Pilgrims, who were ruthless in their own right. They were all staked by corporations and by governments to make money. That was the cash economy. And when people moved westward, settlers moved westward, they were trying to find ways to take more and more value out of the land. The Plains natives struck a mighty blow into the heart of the US military on a number of occasions, and it was through the destruction of their buffalo that the American military finally realized how to subjugate them. The Apache were formidable foes. The Yurok, the Hupa, they were amongst the last contacted, but the history of natives in California was on a level perhaps even more brutal than many other places in the US experience, and that says a lot. So we really honed in on locations. The only story that was just too big for the film was one of Adae's homeland. She really should share that one. She's from the Cochiti Pueblo, outside, in between Santa Fe and Albuquerque, one of the most beautiful places I've ever been, and the site of an ongoing environmental and cultural catastrophe. But the people there are strong, and so it's a hopeful story. But Adae should share that if she doesn't mind.
Adae, please share.
Well, I have to thank Sanjay because the first time he came to film, he came to my grandma's house, and my grandma made him sit down and eat dinner. And of course, you know, a film is pretty expensive, but Sanjay and the whole crew sat down with my grandma and actually filmed her. The film was actually dedicated to her. So I think Sanjay was very kind and recognizing the cultural practices of any community he went into, regardless of how much that cost or not. So that I just recognize Sanjay for that. But yes, my community in Cochiti is the site of a dam built by the Army Corps of Engineers that ended up first being built on some of our prime agricultural lands. Second, it was built faulty, so then it eventually flooded the rest of our homelands, and which caused huge disruptions in the community. An entire generation of Cochiti people were no longer connected to the agricultural history, were no longer able to farm, lost their farmlands. We ended up taking the US government and the Army Corps of Engineers to court. And mind you, these are indigenous farmers who probably didn't make it past high school at best, took the US government to court, actually settled. And when they were offered a settlement amount, the farmers, the grandpas in my community said, we don't want money, we want the restoration of our agricultural lands. So don't give us money, just give us back our lands. And it ended up costing the US government probably more than they would have given us to actually restore those lands. So it's a sad story, but it's a good ending. As a result of that, I think many people in my community became engineers, became lawyers like I did, just to be able to respond to some of these like violent attacks on some of our traditional foodways. And I'm sure Liz has stories of how Abenaki people responded to their 300 years of additional colonial assaults on their communities too.
Liz?
Yeah, absolutely. I mentioned earlier, you know, the eugenics programs that really targeted Abenaki people. That was state sponsored up until the 1970s, you know, so within my lifetime. You know, historically, one of the things that happened is, and I mentioned, is that, you know, a lot of Abenaki folks kind of hid in plain sight. You know, there's still a lot of trauma that we deal with from that now. You know, there's you know, they've done studies on historical trauma and how it actually affects your DNA, and you know, and we see that in Abenaki communities, that, you know, our kids are growing up with effects from the things that our grandparents went through. I feel like I'm being tangential here, so I apologize. You know, there's still a lot of healing that needs to happen here in these communities from, you know, the 500 years of colonialism and exposure to non-Indigenous communities. We're all a work in progress. And we'll be healing for a long time. one of the things that we're really seeing here is cultural resurgence and cultural revitalization and some really strengthening of our communities, which is super important. One of the things that's interesting about my people is that we were never large settlement people. We honestly, Abenakis don't really like each other that much. So we kind of hung out in, you know, small family groups, and we joke around to how you get two Abenakis in a room and then there's going to be a new band that forms because they get into this big argument, you know. So so we're doing a lot of healing, and you know, and trying to like each other again, and really trying to like foster that sense of community, even though we're kind of widespread throughout our homeland. You know, like I said, it's a work in progress, as are all of our communities. Just really, you know, trying to go back to our roots, and I kind of wanted to touch again on that kin-centric idea that we're talking about, that Adae was mentioning. And you know, one of the things, and I talk a lot in terms of seeds and growing food, because, you know, that's what I do. That's who I am as a person. And I remember hearing a Haudenosaunee elder speak once about your seeds and how you have a relationship with them, and you have to consider it a marriage. You know, we're related to everything in nature around us. You know, we have symbiotic relationships with our environment, and that's what makes us who we are. That's, you know, that's how we're created. But this elder, you know, said, you know, treat your seeds like a marriage. You know, you can't plant them one year and, you know, expect that to be the entirety of the relationship that you're going to have with those seeds. You know, it takes, you know, multiple planting seasons, at least 7 planting seasons, to actually form a relationship with those seeds. You know, they're part of our family. They're our protector. You know, they feed us. You know, and that's part of the reason that in our communities, our women are our farmers, and it's because farming and providing food and feeding your families is an extension of life giving. So, you know, traditionally it makes sense that our life givers are the ones who are growing these foods. And that all goes back to that kin-centric ideas. You know, we are all part of the same cloth, so to speak.
That's really beautiful. I think I'm gonna go. I'm like, I have a brown thumb, but listening to you talk about this, I'm going, you know, I'm wanting to, like, you know, go like start a garden and so I can understand and to create this relationship with my food. So this is very inspirational. But there's a part of your response that particularly stood out for me too, and it was the part about healing. And I know how important that is in this whole process. It really, if anything, it's kind of seems to be at the center of it, the healing. And I was drawn to the part in the story about the young men of the Ancestral Guard finding their identity through getting to know the land and their culture and becoming warriors, but for their environment. And so I wrote a book about my own son called Warrior Rising, which is also about finding his own identity with the help of male mentors, the way Nephi was there to help those young men grow up into the men that they were meant to be. And so I really, you know, that part of the story also resonated for me, that this was all about the land and agriculture and food and you know, the regenerative process, but it was also about the human experience. It's also about the richness of being able to, you know, have ownership in your own sovereignty of your land and your food. And it's so connected deeply for me. So I want to, so I just really wanted to thank you for that, because that was where I was tearing up. I was welling up. I became full, you know, of with your storytelling. So I see there are some questions that are coming up in the Q&A box.
Can I just respond to
oh,
that?
Sure, please.
Because I think that's so important, the idea that we have sovereignty over our land and our food and our bodies. And what does that tell us? That like in America, our food system is created so like we don't have control. Like who controls the food we eat? Who controls the land we live on? Who controls what grocery stores we live on? Like all of that is part of this system where the people don't have control. And I think that like we can't minimize that idea that there's something that resonates when you watch the movie that says like, you know what, there's people who are fighting for that control. And it's something that all of Americans and all of our society should be fighting for, because really, I don't think very few people in this country can tell us that they have complete control over their own diet and over their own body and over their own home. Like that is something that is so uniquely American, but is so far from the actual reality that we have presently. So I just wanted to say I appreciate that thought, and I hope that resonates with others, because yes, the film is about indigenous people, and yes, it's about our sovereignty and our rights to food and our ability to care for our communities, but it's also a lesson for all of society that this is something that we all should be working towards, this idea that we can control what we eat, when in actuality, like I don't know if we really know how much control we have over that.
Yes. Yeah, I got it. It came through loud and clear. And especially when, I was talking earlier today at the Food Funded conference, and the topic came up around, you know, what processed foods and what agribusiness has done to like our diets, you know, and that was also, that story was told in the film as well. You know, how all of a sudden, you know, you with all the junk foods and the processed food and Twinkies and pop and all that kind of stuff, when our natural foods that we grow and you know, take care of and are more nutritious and, you know, are better for us. And so agribusiness has come in and, you know, taken all that away and have taken control of our health and have taken control of our bodies and are taking control of our economy and everything, right? And it's so that truth telling that comes through in the film is so powerful, and I think resonates with various sectors of people in our country. African Americans, you know, have been exploited that way as well. So that was yeah, this film is powerful on so many levels. So I wanted to allow some questions in the last remaining minutes from people who are have submitted a few, and if you haven't, there's a chat going on, and then we got a Q&A box going on, and I would ask if you have a question, if you could put it in the Q&A box, I'll get it. But there's one from, thank you, they're coming in, from Isabel Cole. She asks, how can we help advocate for Native people's rights and land and support these movements and projects and change the white narrative to one that includes everyone and their history? So the question is, how can we advocate? What can we do? How can we support your work?
Well, I think part of that too, and I saw the question early on, and I've been kind of, you know, ruminating on how to answer it, but I think part of it really is having the respect of the, that the indigenous folks have the rights to their own seeds, to their own foods, to their food practices. And it's, so, and I guess I'm coming from an Abenaki perspective here, where we see a lot of people who are non-native, you know, learning Abenaki, learning our languages, and coming into the classes and taking ownership of that language, even though it's not theirs traditionally. So, and I apologize if this doesn't sound, you know, PC, but really acknowledging that the sovereignty and that the Native folks are the ones with the stake in those indigenous foods. I think that that's a super important part of this that may not always be addressed.
Okay.
Well, and I would add that part of our collective responsibility as people who live in this country is to tell the true stories about how this country began. I mean, we all here, I think it's fitting that we're having this film festival in New England. You know, in Indian country, we call that the Eastern Gateway. We have an Eastern Gateway, we have a Western Gateway, and the Eastern Gateway was opened up much sooner than the rest of the country. But like the true story about colonialism, of Thanksgiving, of the history of this country, like needs to be told. It's not currently. 2020, we still see narrative. I still can walk into any classroom in America and I'll still see the Indian and the Pilgrim, like, you know, on children every year. Like that's something that needs to change. And the only way we can, you know, to be honest, we don't get much response from schools and school districts. I think there's movements in different parts of the country, but like for me and my children, I tell my children about, you know, it's hard to tell a 7-year-old the atrocities that happen, but I'm figuring out ways. So my daughter knows that, you know, it's not all happy turkeys and happy people. Like it's a very hard history to swallow, but it's one that needs to be told because it recognizes who we are as Indigenous people. And it says we are still here. Like we are still here. In any part of this country, you can go and meet an Indigenous person, and those stories need to be told and recognized. Like that's how we become a better country, and that's how we become better stewards of our lands, is we tell the stories of the people who were there before colonization.
Anyone else want to add to what Adae?
Yeah, I just want to follow up on telling the stories. That's part of that relationship with our seeds, is, you know, knowing where they came from, knowing the history, you know, who grew this. There's something very, very powerful about knowing that I grow and eat the same foods that my ancestors grew tens of thousands of years ago. Knowing those stories is incredibly powerful. You know, my mom's a storyteller. She tells the stories for our tribe, you know, so just knowing how things came about, why things are the way they are, those are our life lessons. That's how we learn. That's how we become members of our community. And that is so important.
So Svetlana asks a really good question. She's a public educator, and she asks, how can we make kin-centric ecology relatable to those who are non-Indigenous?
Well, I'll start. One of the most, I guess, powerful stories that my grandpa ever told me, and I'll share that with everybody here, is that there's this farmer who eventually started farming on Cochiti land, which was historically Cochiti land. And me, as the young person who like sees the injustice, I was like, Papa, we have to get him off the land. You know, this is Cochiti land. This is our land. And he quietly, in his very powerful and wise way, pulled me aside and he said, you know, this person has been on this land for about 150 years. Like that's a long time for this person to be on this land. And if this person is on this land for 150 years, he has a responsibility to this land, just like we have a responsibility to this land. And as much as like it hurts to see this part of our land taken from us, we have, like, our job is to remind people that this land has to be taken care of. Like that's part of our original stewardship. And so like people freak out when they see the hashtag land back, but really it's a reminder to people that like you have to take care of this land. There are thousands of generations that took care of this land before you were on it. You have responsibilities to this place, just like we do as Indigenous people. And so none of those things, whether you're on a piece of land for 5 years or 100 or 1,000, like there are serious responsibilities to ensuring that we are all living in this place like as healthy people with healthy environments, with clean water, with trees. You know, one of the first things colonialism colonists did was cut the trees so they could build houses and create farms. You know, those are part of the landscapes. And so understanding the history of these lands is important. And if you can't do that, give the land back to the indigenous people. We are more willing to accept it now more than ever. So Liz, I'm gonna turn it over to you.
One of the things that I just wanted to follow up with, you know, in your comment about, you know, white folks coming in and cutting down all the trees is, you know, we, going back to like the Puritans and the Pilgrim stories, they, you know, when the Puritans came over to this continent, they saw all the, you know, all the empty villages and the land that was ready to grow food and, you know, crops that were, you know, coming to fruition in the fields. And they said, oh, this is a sign from God that this land was meant to be. For us, it's, you know, we were meant to come here. And really what it was is that the diseases that they brought killed everybody already. And the land had already been planted for the season. So, you know, just, you know, people don't realize that, you know, Native people have, you know, land stewardship techniques that, you know, we employ today. So I may have, you know, gone on a tangent again and not answered the question, but, you know, that's something that just strikes me frequently is that, you know, again, it goes back to relationships. We knew our land and we knew the things to do to care for it, to provide food for our communities.
Okay, so thank you for, you know, answering that. You did answer the question. So you built on it, which is good. So, but I'm looking in chat and I see a lot of requests from listeners who are asking, how can they share this film with their class? How do they donate or contribute to your work? So, which is all great news. I'm sure this is exactly what we want. So, who wants to share that information? You can either just tell us, and I'll make sure that I enter it into the chat so everybody sees. Where do people need to go in order to be able to share this film in their classrooms or in their organizations? And also, how do we contribute to money and funds that go to the work that you're doing into indigenous peoples and the work and the programs that you're working on?
Well, I'll answer the screenings part. For people who are interested in gifting the film to others, the film is available on iTunes and on Amazon right now. For organizations outside of Indian country, non-tribal organizations, from nonprofits to farmers markets, co-ops, and to classrooms, they can email me, and I'm punching the email address right into the chat room, gather.film@gmail.com, and we can help arrange a screening. As for support, that's in the realm of Adae.
Yes. Well, first, I think, you know, there's some great organizations that we feature in the film. Like if any one of those speak to you, I would encourage you to go visit their websites, Ancestral Guard. They're called the Nature's Rights Council in California, and also Café Gojo is wonderful. Elsie Dubray works with an organization in South Dakota, right, Sanjay? And then lastly, firstnations.org is an organization that supports food and community projects across Indian country. And I'll let Liz tell you about iCollective.
Yes, iCollective. We forgot about that. Tell us about iCollective.
So iCollective, it's a group of chefs, culture bearers, artists that we formed several years ago. And as you mentioned at the beginning, it stands for Indigenous, Inspired, Innovative, and Independent. So what we're really concerned about is, again, changing the narrative and educating about, you know, food disparities, food deserts, really involved with food justice, bringing back indigenous pre-colonial foodways and diets to indigenous communities. So I know that right now our latest project is several of the iCollective chefs have come from Navajo and from the Washington State area, and they are actually taking a residency in a restaurant in Northampton, Massachusetts called The Belly and the Beast. And so this is just kicking off this last weekend, actually. And so we have a couple chefs in residence who are going to be preparing menus based on pre-colonial indigenous foods. Thank you for putting that link up there for the GoFundMe, Sanjay. So they are trying to raise money to help cover the costs of the chefs and the kitchen crews that are going to be working there. Also, thank you for the Facebook page. So obviously, because of COVID right now, programming is way more challenging than it would be ordinarily. But a lot of our work is centered around, you know, educating on pre-colonial foods and gathering techniques. And it's really just a neat little organization. So please check us out.
Okay, Melissa Redwin lives 15 minutes from there. That's what she just.
Well, you really should go check out The Belly and the Beast. Also check out their Facebook page and their website. They are also linking to the iCollective events. I know that as of Sunday, it was still in progress as we're still working out the menus and the schedule, whatnot. Our chefs are still, you know, going through their COVID tests and their quarantines right now, but we should start to see things pretty soon. So please, you know, go eat really good food, donate to the GoFundMe, just really enjoy everything that the iCollective and The Belly and the Beast have to offer.
Thank you, Liz. And we're getting, you know, a little bit past the hour. We've gone a little bit longer, but folks have stayed with us. Apparently, you struck a chord with our audience, and people are still tuned in, and that's exciting to hear. But I know that you guys have other things to do, so I'm just going to ask as a wrap up, and you just want to take a minute to give a last minute thought about the film, or about your work, or about what's next? You know, you know, what's coming up for each one of you. Sanjay, anything that you're working on that we should be aware of? Adae, you know, the work that you're doing, how can, you know, what do we need to know about? Any update? Liz, same with you. Well, we'll start with Sanjay.
Well, we're trying to get as many people to watch the film as possible around Indigenous Peoples Day, which is this Monday, October 12th. November is Native American Heritage Month. Again, an important time to reflect on the first people and the way food has been used in the act of colonization, but how important those food traditions are to communities and how their stewardship has really made so much possible for the rest of us. So I'm always plugging the movie, and that's what I'm going to commit to until Adae tells me to stop.
And likewise, encourage people to watch the movie. I think it's a good starter conversation for many issues that are happening in this country, from like a retelling of the history of this country. Let's start at the beginning. And here's a great movie to watch. And in addition, if you want to support Indigenous food and agriculture projects that may be near you, First Nations has an entire grant database that's searchable by state and by amount or by keyword. So if there's something that interests you, I would encourage you to go search that database and find an indigenous project that's near you that you may become involved in. Liz?
Well, thank you. Next steps for me is I'm actually kind of in a huge transitionary period personally. Like I mentioned, I relocated to a new state. I am also a nurse, so working in a hospital in COVID times is also very interesting, working on advanced degrees, so on and so forth. So unfortunately, I tend to be a little bit of a homebody right now, but you know, it is harvest season, so we're working on bringing in as many of the crops as we can. And then I'm looking forward to spring where I can start planting more stuff.
Well, thank you. And so I want to make sure that I do share with the audience that the American Sustainable Business Council Race and Equity Working Group has a track where we work on policy, public policy, governmental issues surrounding food justice. And so I'm going to invite Adae, Liz, and Sanjay to join a future discussion and share with that audience some of the work that you're doing, and through the lens of what public policy, what government's impact has been on, you know, your challenges and with food sovereignty and taking back your land and you know, ownership of your food processes. How do we support that work? How do we leverage our voices and our votes and Congress, hold them accountable to do the right thing? So we welcome you to be a part of that conversation. And I don't know if you are familiar with Valerie Redhorse Mall, who was the executive director of the Social Venture Circle, who also does a lot of work in this space, who's helping lead our initiative around Native American rights. So with that, I'm going to say again, thank you so much for this wonderful opportunity to meet all of you and learn about your work and see this incredible film. And we'll be following you closely. And I want to thank all the participants for showing up and being there for us tonight. And if anybody, you know, wants to find out more information, we'll send you all the links via email. Dee is capturing all this information as we go. So you'll hear from us again. So with that, I'm going to wish you all a good night, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you, MaryAnne. It's been lovely. Wow, this has been an incredible just experience. I can't believe everything that I've heard and learned and how much more, you know, I understand in such a short period of time. Again, thanks to everybody, all of our panelists speaking truth to power and really opening up our eyes and our minds on what's been going on. I think we all knew it. We just, you know, allowed it not to be front and center. So, you know, my heart is touched. I just want to thank once again, you know, MaryAnne, Sanjay, Adae, Liz. You guys are just incredible. And also our partners, the Monadnock Food Co-op, Monadnock Farm and Community Coalition, First Nations Institute, and gather.film for making this possible. And of course, as MaryAnne said, this wouldn't be the experience it is without the participants. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for watching the film, and help us get the word out about Gather. Share it. Buy, you know, a gift subscription to the film on one of the platforms, but let's get the word out. This session is being recorded. Someone asked if it was being recorded, and yes, we are definitely recording it. We will make it available in a follow-up email. So thank you. And good night, everyone. Take it easy.